A new Catholic dating app was recently released for straight Catholic singles, Sacred Spark. And actually, its release gives a good opportunity for this gay Catholic to talk about what chastity is in the church and how actually a lot of Catholic leaders misrepresent it. Before we hop into today's video, make sure you hit subscribe and follow along, and make sure you let me know what you think in the comments after you listen. As part of the profile building, in its release, it asked users if they value chastity. Users, when they answered the question, didn't realize that if they said no, their profile would have a little tag on it that says, "does not value chastity." And next to that tag would be a little broken heart icon. Now, there's a lot I can say about that design choice. One of my concerns is that it invites people who are trying to openly and vulnerably interact with an app and find love. And then, if they answer the app's questions wrongly, it shames them for their answers and brands that shame publicly. It kicks off their Catholic dating journey with a profile branding them with a broken heart. But what I want to focus on here is actually how I think the question and the way it's presented encourages misunderstandings of the Catholic conception of chastity. I've gotten a lot of questions around chastity and how I view chastity as it relates to this stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about chastity and the Catechism. This is a little bit funny. Heathen homosexual is going to catechize to you about chastity, but actually I think that what the church has to say about chastity is beautiful and helpful, and I think it has a lot to offer people, even people who disagree with a lot of what the church has to say about sexuality and when one can or should have sex. I just think that in general, the church has a lot of really helpful things to say about chastity, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But maybe before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about what doctrine is and what it means for doctrine to be a living idea. I love this stuff, so you're going to be getting it all now. So when I think about doctrine and first principles and how these things relate to each other and develop, I think a lot about Saint John Henry Newman, because that's who I spend a lot of time studying. For Newman, doctrines that are true are living ideas that are ever expanding and that drive human action. He writes about this in his essay on the development of doctrine. He begins the book with a discussion of ideas. He says, when an idea, whether real or not, is of a nature to arrest and possess the mind, it may be said to have life, that is, to live in the mind, which is its recipient. He says that when an idea gets possession of the popular mind, at first people aren't going to realize what it is that moves them, and they'll try to express and explain themselves, but they'll do it inadequately. And there's going to be a lot of confusion when people are figuring out these things. There'll be a lot of misconceptions about the idea and things that are in conflict. But over time, he says, things will be clarified and new light will be brought to bear upon all these things. And after a while, he says some definitive teaching emerges. He says that this is a process where the aspects of an idea are brought into consistency and form, and he calls this process the idea's development. So there's something that's initially presented, and it engages with the community in various ways, interacts with their lived experiences and in discourse, and over time, it kind of solidifies into something that's more concrete. And Newman says that ideas, to the extent that they're living, will undergo this process basically consistently. He says that to the extent an idea is living, it will continue to develop. It will evolve and change as it encounters new circumstances and people and other ideas and arguments. On the other hand, if an idea loses its life, then it will crystallize, and we can tell that an idea has died once it stops being capable of change, of evolution, of development. This is partly why he says that ideas have to change. Ideas have to continue to grow and evolve, partly to continue with their living principle. He says that it changes in order to remain the same. He writes, in a higher world it is otherwise, but here below to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Now, not every change is faithful to the original idea, and he says that a false or unfaithful development is more properly to be called a corruption. So we should be attentive to how ideas change and develop, and to whether changes are actually outgrowths of the idea, or if they're actually something else. And he said that Christianity itself impresses itself upon the mind just like this. And a Christian doctrine that I think gives a really good example of how this process of development works is the Catholic understanding of chastity. Now, a lot of people misunderstand what chastity is in Catholic teaching. And so I'll have us go back to that app where the question is, do you value chastity? I think that what the question is actually getting at, and what users are encouraged to interpret it as, is, do you want to have sex before marriage? But that's actually a question of abstinence. They're really asking, do you plan to abstain from sex before marriage? That's not really what chastity is in its fullness. So what is chastity? To get one answer, we can turn to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Paragraph 2337 of the Catechism says, Chastity means the successful integration of sexuality within the person, and thus the inner unity of man in his bodily and spiritual being. And interestingly, if you read the first 10 paragraphs of the Catechism when it comes to chastity, where it's explaining at the highest levels the principle of chastity, you won't see the Catechism talking about sex. Instead, the Catechism talks about how chastity is about the integrity of the person. The Catechism says that chastity neither tolerates a double life nor duplicity in speech. It says chastity includes an apprenticeship in self-mastery. It focuses on how chastity seeks and facilitates human freedom. It focuses on developing self-knowledge, a practice of ascesis, obedience to God's commandments, exercising the moral virtues, and fidelity to prayer. It says chastity is a moral virtue and a gift of God, a grace, a fruit of spiritual effort. It says chastity blossoms in friendship and is expressed notably in friendship with one's neighbor. When we read what the Catechism has to say about chastity as a principle, we see that it's much less about checking boxes, about whether you do or don't do specific things, and it's much more virtue understood in the classical sense, where virtue is a habit, a capacity that you cultivate and develop. It's about freedom and integrity and gift of self, things that aren't just achieved in a moment, but which you continually develop and offer over the course of your entire life, and which you develop and offer in new ways as you meet new circumstances in your life. You can see this when the Catechism says that chastity's self-mastery is a long and exacting work, or one can never consider it acquired once and for all, and it presupposes renewed effort at all stages in life. It says chastity has laws of growth, and it involves a cultural effort and interdependence between personal betterment and the improvement of society. Chastity is both a personal and a social virtue. I'll come back to that social aspect in a bit. But seeing chastity as a virtue in this way is related to chastity as a living idea. Just as chastity expresses itself in the world as a constantly cultivated capacity in a human life, chastity expresses itself as an idea that is constantly evolving in the mind of the Church. Chastity says that an idea, and especially a living idea, is going to have many aspects, and we can kill chastity either in its embodied expression or as an idea when we hinder its expansion or reduce it to just one of its aspects. When it comes to ideas, again, one of the ways an idea can die is that it'll crystallize into something where nothing else can be said about it, or it doesn't have the ability to grow and evolve over time. And one of the ways that this can happen is when you reduce an idea to just one of its aspects or expressions. For example, when you reduce it to a checkbox, which I think that dating app gives a good example of, reducing chastity to a simple yes or no. Doing that, for one thing, actually just misunderstands the fullness of what chastity is, but second, it actually kills the idea of chastity because it drastically reduces it and makes it smaller than what it actually is, and it hinders expansion, growth, development, further elaboration. As G.K. Chesterton has written, a heresy is always a half-truth turned into a whole falsehood. There are a lot of half-truths turned to whole falsehoods when it comes to presentations of chastity in the Church, and part of this discussion is to help the Church do better. I worry that partial presentations can turn chastity into a heresy or something akin to hedonism. I really appreciate what Alistair McIntyre has to say about hedonism in his book, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. In the book, he gives a hypothetical situation, exploring the development of virtue. He writes, quote, "Suppose then that someone recognizing the need to integrate their activities," note McIntyre focusing on the question of integration, which is central to chastity, "but being fearful and cautious, adopt as a principle to act so as to minimize their exposure to situations that can get out of hand, that might take them into unfamiliar and unpredictable territory," end quote. In this discussion, we might think about someone who sees chastity as primarily about avoiding sex, and who does everything they can to avoid the possibility of sex, such that they resist intimacy and connection with anyone that they might be interested in. McIntyre suggests that what this person is doing is not developing virtue, but actually practicing a form of hedonism. He writes, quote, "Hedonists act so as to ensure that, so far as possible, what they do and what happens to them gives pleasure and avoids pain. Our imagined fearful and cautious agent makes the avoidance of what pains him his overriding objective, so making the hedonist mistake of supposing that agents should take their appetites and aversions as given and choose their goods accordingly, rather than working to transform their appetites and aversions so that they may achieve goods which otherwise they will have to renounce," end quote. So actually, when you make chastity about avoiding sex, what you're doing is transforming the virtue of chastity into something akin to hedonism. That's not to argue that avoiding sex before marriage is itself a form of hedonism, but it is to say when you replace chastity with abstinence, then you're losing the virtue of chastity and are instead adopting a dynamic that's more akin to hedonism than it is to virtue. Those are some of the things that I worry about here, and this is partly why I take issue with the ways in which a lot of Catholics talk about chastity. They eliminate chastity as a virtue and make it into something else. Such an approach can have lasting negative effects, as we can see in connections between, for example, purity culture and vaginismus. Vaginismus is a condition suffered by many women where they experience tensing of their vaginal muscles that can make sexual intercourse extremely painful. Studies have found correlations between vaginismus and women who grew up under the auspices of purity culture, where they were taught to associate unmarried sexual desire with evil and cultivated intense fear around sexual arousal and intimacy with men. I actually know many women who have suffered from vaginismus, who grew up under purity culture, strove to protect their purity, and were told that if they did this, then sex within marriage would be beautiful, and then those women struggled to have sex once they got married. For some of these women, these struggles lasted for years, and for at least a couple, the struggles are still ongoing. If we as a community have contributed to this condition through our overly negative messaging around sexual desire, then we have committed a social sin against chastity and against these women. Rather than chastity as a virtue, we've offered them something else. We've taught them shame. Shame is really important here because shame is one of the ways in which freedom can be hindered, especially freedom in your sexuality. I often think that shame can do more to hinder your development of chastity than specific sins, even if sins are to be taken seriously and worked against. If you want to promote chastity, then the prevalence of shame in the world is something to be attentive to, and this would involve a lot of Catholic leaders making significant changes. The Catechism's presentation of chastity would in a lot of ways challenge how a lot of Catholic leaders talk about and form their institutions and communities when it comes to a number of issues related to sexuality. I think about experiences of LGBTQ people as a really good example. The Catechism says that chastity tolerates neither double lives nor duplicity in speech. It says chastity is about integration. It focuses on freedom. But how many Catholic communities say they prioritize chastity while also encouraging LGBTQ people to hide our experiences, to have double lives in terms of allowing others to assume that we experience the world in a way that's very different from how we actually do? How many communities encourage duplicity in speech by driving people into hiding when it comes to their experiences? And how many Catholic communities drive especially gay people to be afraid of friendship and intimacy with others? Whereas the Catechism says chastity is expressed notably in friendship with one's neighbor and that it blossoms in friendship. When we read the actual text of the Catechism, I think it's fair to ask whether a lot of Catholic communities work against chastity for LGBTQ+ people, especially ones that claim to be proponents of Catholic orthodoxy. To the extent that we develop true chastity, there will be more openness, freedom, integrity, and the ability to speak honestly about our experiences and share them with others and use them as a point of connection. How many Catholic communities offer a counter witness to the gospel by actively working against that? I suspect one of the reasons why we don't get this more holistic and integral presentation of chastity in a lot of Catholic communities is because it's hard, and it would challenge a lot of things about those communities. For example, how many Catholic communities allege Catholic orthodoxy when it comes to chastity and sexuality, while failing to provide the conditions where all kids can get a good education? The Catechism says, interestingly, chastity presupposes respect for the rights of the person, in particular, the right to receive information and an education that respects the moral and spiritual dimensions of human life. It's really important to note how the Catechism frames this. Chastity isn't just something that comes out of a vacuum. Actually, there are presuppositions involved, and that includes a respect for the rights of the person and also information and education that respects the various dimensions of human life. But this isn't something you'll hear very often when it comes to popularizers of Catholic teaching on sexuality when they're talking about chastity. They won't present as a starting point for chastity the rights of the person and information and education about the various dimensions of human life. Instead, often people get the impression that chastity is a presupposition for your rights as a Catholic in, for example, employment. The Catechism suggests nearly the opposite. It says that if we're not respecting the rights of people to an appropriate education or in other areas of life, then we're not setting up the conditions for chastity as a virtue. This helps to explain other things the Catechism has to say about moral culpability, chastity, and sins. In its discussion of masturbation, the Catechism says that to form an equitable judgment about the subject's moral responsibility and to guide pastoral action, one must take into account the effect of immaturity, force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety, or other psychological or social factors that can lessen, if not even reduce to a minimum, moral culpability. This is for a sin that the Catechism also describes as an intrinsically and gravely disordered action. It turns out, though, that the gravity of intrinsically and gravely disordered sins is largely informed by personal and social contexts that we need to be attentive to. This makes sense in a lot of ways and is consistent with what studies have been finding for decades. Decades ago, Richard Sipe conducted an extensive longitudinal study of the sexual practices of Catholic clergy. He focused on priests' faithfulness to celibacy. He found that, in general, priests did not do a very good job. But interestingly, he said that for priests who did reach a mature adjustment to celibacy, they had 4 elements in common. They had productive work, a well-defined prayer life, a deep sense of community, and a dedication to service. When we understand what the Catechism has to say about chastity, this makes sense. Chastity isn't just about whether or not you're having sex. It's actually much more about this broader experience and cultivation of the human person. And you need these other things in your life in order to live out well the specific applications of chastity. I'd argue that probably what the church needs is fewer talks about chastity that focus on whether or not to have sex and whether or not to masturbate, and we probably need more talks and more environments that cultivate good work for people, good prayer lives, community, a dedication to service. Again, if chastity presupposes respect for the rights of the person, why do we not see the rights of laborers as a precondition for certain expectations around chastity as a community? Why do we see these things as entirely separate when the Catechism doesn't separate them in that way? And even when studies like Richard Sipe's find that productive work is an important element for people who reach a mature adjustment to celibacy, there are a lot of Catholic parishes that harp on people about chastity and at the same time fail to pay their workers a living wage. And when we read the Catechism in this way, I think it's fair to ask, are those parishes really entitled to make demands when it comes to chastity of their parishioners? All this leads me to kind of a funny position. The popular Catholic theology of the body speakers and popularizers of Catholic teaching on sexuality, when I disagree with them, I don't think it's typically me disagreeing with the church. I think it's typically me seeing that I think they actually get this Catholic concept wrong, which maybe is full of ironies, but it makes sense. This stuff is hard, and it's complicated, and it's nuanced. And I think that when we try to simplify it, we tend to kill these ideas, which is why we really have to be careful and humble with popular presentations of theology. It's important to talk about them as popular presentations, as opposed to the fullness of this idea. If I'm being honest, and not to throw apologists under the bus, because honestly a lot of what I do here is maybe a sort of apologetics, but there's something non-theological about apologetics. And there's something about apologetics that tends to, I think, kill theology and Catholic doctrine for a lot of the reasons that I've already shared here. I also think that for deep virtues, you don't fully understand them until they become a part of your life. And so when it comes to chastity, there are a lot of things that will not make sense to you until you found a place where you're living them out. Or there may be aspects of chastity where you don't fully understand them until you come to a good relationship with those aspects of chastity. This is why I think married straight people should be really cautious about giving advice on chastity to, for example, single queer people. Chastity expresses itself uniquely in every life. What works well for some people may not work well for others, and our understanding of these nuances will be limited by our personal experiences. I think this is one of the odd things about virtue and the Catholic treatment of it. It's also very human, that you understand it when you live it. I also suspect that because of this reason, the more you live it out, the less important it'll be to get an intellectually correct presentation of it. I could be wrong, but that's a suspicion. I'll end with maybe my most controversial take yet, but I think it's something that's consistent with the Catechism, or at least my understanding of it. When you start to think about chastity this way, chastity starts to look much more like a journey towards increasing integration, where you just start with wherever you are and then you grow from there. Which is why I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that a Catholic can have sex before marriage and also be interested in and committed to growing in chastity. Again, think about chastity as a principle of growth, freedom, integration, honesty, concern, and care for others. Someone who has sex before marriage, while being attentive to consent and how their words and actions intimately impact the other, is practicing and cultivating ways of relating that encourage all of those aspects related to chastity. I think you can even say this if you believe that sex before marriage is wrong. Another person who doesn't hold that belief, but who really wants to be attentive to how their sexual activities impact themselves and others, can be cultivating various aspects of chastity, even if you don't think that they're cultivating all of them. If you believe that sex before marriage is wrong and you see that person, the way to encourage them in chastity may not be to shame them for doing something you disagree with, but inviting them more deeply to lean into the positive values they're already pursuing. This is what Pope Benedict XVI does in his discussion, where he says that using condoms can be a start of a journey towards love. In one section of the book, Light of the World, Benedict is discussing poor male sex workers who may be exposed to HIV and AIDS, and he talks about them using condoms. He says, quote, "She, the church, of course does not regard it as a real or moral solution. But in this or that case, there can be, nonetheless, in the intention of reducing the risk of infection, a first step in a movement toward a different way, a more human way of living sexuality." End quote. Benedict generally doesn't approve of condom use, but in the circumstances of male sex workers who have to do this to be able to feed themselves, actually them using condoms can be a first step towards chastity, towards a more human way of sexuality. But I think you're unable to recognize or acknowledge or have space for these types of complex situations and these types of distinctions to the extent that your view of chastity has stopped being a living idea. To the extent to where it's crystallized and really become a list of very specific rules and that make the most sense in a hyper-privileged, somewhat wealthy American context. So, in the end, chastity is a journey. It's a journey towards love, freedom, integration, respect for the rights of others, self-mastery. And when we understand chastity like this, who wouldn't want chastity? Sure, a lot of people disagree with the Catechism's application of these aspects of chastity. But when we develop a fuller understanding of chastity as a principle, as a living idea, we can see it as something that actually probably everyone wants in some way. When you start to think about chastity this way, we can approach it much more like Aristotle's approach to natural law and ethics and moral questions. For Aristotle, when he's starting out his Nicomachean Ethics, basically what he does is he looks around and he says, oh, well, what is it that everyone wants? And he kind of just observes that, oh, it seems like everyone wants happiness. And then he goes around and he sees what different people think happiness is and makes sense of it based on what's out there in the world. Similarly, I think if you go out there and look at the world and you have this principle of chastity that we've just discussed, we can see that actually most people want integration and freedom and all these other aspects that we know are part of chastity. Asking on a dating website whether someone values chastity is silly because everyone wants a deeper connection with others. Everyone wants chastity in some way, whether they realize it or not. I think that the church has this really big living idea of chastity that has a lot to offer even to people who disagree with certain regulations when it comes to sexual practice. So one thing that I'd say to Catholics who've deconstructed or are deconstructing or have deconverted, but who still see this virtue as meaningful and beautiful and life-giving, one thing I'd say is you don't have to let other Catholics take this from you. You can still have it. You're entitled to it. And maybe you just have a different relationship to it now. You can have chastity wherever you are because chastity is for you wherever you are. You just keep growing. If you liked today's video and you want to see more, make sure you subscribe or you can follow me on Instagram at cdamianwrites.